Thank you, Xiaopeng, for such a gracious introduction, and ni hao, everybody. Glad to be here. I'd like to start by sharing my screen, and we'll be focusing on what I'm calling effective energy policy for decarbonization. The title doesn't say for which nation, whether I'm talking about for the United States or for China. And that's for a specific reason. I will be talking about themes which I think are relevant, highly relevant for both of our nations as we go forward in effective in policymaking for decarbonizing our nations. I'd like to start with what I think for many of us, or I think for everybody who are focusing on clean energy, we're thinking about how do you develop a sustainable energy system. And what I mean by sustainable has a few characteristics. Some of those are having to do with the efficiency of the system, how equitable it is, how fair it is. Is the energy affordable? Is there plenty of it? There's abundant, competitive, profitable. We're thinking about how do you develop a sustainable energy system. And what I mean by sustainable, somehow I'm coming back with a long lag and an echo. I'm not quite sure how that's happening. But in any event, these I'll call those issues of the economy, and the economics of energy is very important. Second, it has to do with, we would like for it to be a sustainable system, to have domestic and internationally secure, predictable sources of it, a resilience when something goes wrong, it can continue back, and a reliable source of energy. I'll call that all security issues. And third, it should be environmentally protective, particularly for the climate, because we have the fundamental problem of global climate change, but also for air quality and on water resources. I'll call that the environment. Together, I'll think of this as the energy policy triangle, that as we think about developing energy policy for either of our nations, we need to be paying attention to a balance of all three of those issues and think of the trade-offs. Today, though, I'm not going to talk about the security issues or the economic issues particularly, but the environmental issues and focus on global climate change. You've probably all seen these data on the territorial carbon dioxide emissions, the red being China, the emissions as we see growing from 1960 to now, to the data I have completely is only for 2019. Yeah, China is the first biggest emitter, US is the second biggest, and all of Europe, the 27 countries of EU together, are the third. That's what we'll call territorial carbon dioxide emissions. That's the emissions that are generated in the territory of the nation. In some sense, it's a misleading measure, because if you produce manufactured goods, say steel, and ship it to the United States and it's used in the United States, well, should you attribute the carbon emissions to China, where it's emitted, or the United States, which wanted to use the steel in the first place? Well, that suggests that there may be another way of measuring carbon dioxide, and that is consumption carbon dioxide emissions, where you take that steel, for example, and attribute all the carbon dioxide in producing the steel that's used in the United States, not to China, but to the United States. So with laborious work, other people, not me, other people have done those calculations. And only going back to 1990, we don't have as long a data space, it still tells somewhat the same story. The carbon dioxide emissions from China, if you have a territorial, that's 10 billion tons a year. It's 9 billion if you only do the consumption calculation. And for the United States, if you use territorial, you'll calculate 5 billion. And if you have consumption, you'll have about 5.75 billion. So there's about 10%, 10 to 15% difference between these two measures. But whatever way you measure it, your country, China, my country, the United States, are the biggest emitters of carbon dioxide in the world. And so we're the two countries that are most fundamentally need to deal with the problem. So I want to focus the whole attention on dealing with this problem. And I think of 4 pathways for energy, for carbon dioxide or greenhouse gas emissions from the energy system. I'm only going to focus on the energy system. That's the dominant way we create greenhouse gas. I'm not going to pay attention to agriculture. Agriculture is another important issue. For reforestation, land use is important, but energy is bigger than everything else together. And therefore, I will focus just on decarbonization of energy system. And the framework that I think of as the 4 things that we need to do: energy efficiency, end-use substitution, low carbon energy production, and carbon capture and storage. Energy efficiency, what I mean is using less energy while still allowing our economies to grow vibrantly and without penalizing the economic welfare of the nation. So energy efficiency is using less energy, keeping the economy going. End-use substitution is moving from carbon-intensive end uses of energy to having the same end use that uses less carbon-intensive energy. That typically would mean something like moving from a gasoline-powered automobile to an electric automobile that would release fewer emissions. Low carbon energy production, that's the thing that most people think about in decarbonizing the energy system. That would be wind and solar and hydropower and maybe nuclear and the clean forces of energy. And then another one, which is less significant now, but could become extremely important at a later time: carbon capture and storage. That's using fossil fuels, but instead of releasing the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, capture it and store it permanently underground. So I'd like to talk briefly about each one of these. Energy efficiency, we see examples all around. The continuing revolution of lighting, where we have light emitting diodes that instead of using 60 watts for a given amount of electricity, they use maybe 11 watts, and that's getting smaller. Motion sensing lights and switches. When I was a child, my parents were always saying something like, "Jim, don't you ever know how to turn off the lights when you're done?" Now parents don't have to do it. The child leaves the room, the parents leave the room, the lights turn themselves off. That's very important in in commercial buildings where people often don't pay attention to turn off the lights and motion sensing lights. In buildings, better insulation of buildings, high efficiency furnaces, all energy efficiency in buildings. We have a great example in refrigeration in the United States. This graph shows refrigerator energy use, and it shows the red was the average energy use per refrigerator installed in a home, going back to 1947, where it used about 375, less than 400 kilowatt hours. By the time of the energy crisis in 1974, the new refrigerator on average would use 1,800 kilowatt hours, until there was a deliberate decision in the federal government to create new technologies and promote them that would use less energy for the same amount of refrigeration, so that by now, and I don't have the most recent data, but we're down to the energy used for an average refrigerator about the same as that we had in 1947. This blue is the size of the refrigerators. Refrigerators are continuing to get larger with newer features. And so we have good refrigeration, larger refrigeration, but we use a lot less energy. These are examples of energy efficiency. One of my favorite has to do with the air transportation, airlines, data from the United States. This is the energy intensity of air travel in thousands of BTU per seat mile. This is, you ask how many seats are on the airplane, how much they fly, how much energy used. And we see from the time of the 1973-74 oil embargo, where in the, say, international or energy domestic flights, we use between 4,000 and 6,000 BTUs per seat mile. And now by 2015, it was between 2 and 2.5 BTUs. So airplanes became more efficient. We have these winglets on airplanes that are aerodynamically efficient, lighter metals and lighter bodies, more efficient engines. So all of those have led to the BTUs per seat mile being reduced by a factor of a little over 2 in those years. Perhaps more dramatically, though, is remembering commercial airlines are not in business just to fly the seats. They're in business to fly people. So you can look at the energy used per passenger mile and look at what the changes has been over time, where in the data just before the oil crisis, BTUs per passenger mile were between 10 and 11,000 per passenger mile, and now down between 3 and 4 per passenger mile. That's because the airlines have learned to keep the airlines very full through yield management. Yield management, very complex, stochastic, dynamic optimization programs that the airlines run on a daily basis that leads them to change the price of the airlines, maybe on airline tickets, on an hourly basis based upon the projections whether flights will be full or not, and have allowed the airlines to keep the capacity factor at almost 100%, and therefore led to massive amount of energy efficiency while still being able to allow people to fly across the country or across the world. Another example is at a systems level. This is very, very close to home for me at Stanford. This is the integrated campus-wide for all of Stanford heating and cooling system. It has electric chillers that chill water, and it uses the electricity to chill the water only at times when electricity is very cheap. That could be in the middle of the day where we have too much electricity in California from solar, or the middle of the night where very few people to use it. We can chill water and put it in tanks. We have for emergency boilers if we need additional heating, but usually using electric. So notice that this is involving both fuel switching and efficiency. The water is put in these massive hot water and cold water tanks, and those tanks have water shipped throughout the campus for heating and cooling. But then in every building, you have heat recovery systems. So when the cold air is ejected from the building to get fresh air, and it's a hot day, that coldness is captured and put back in the water system. Similarly, on a heated building and a cold day. So we have things like this are not unique to Stanford. We have corporations and industry engineering, innovating to use less energy in order to accomplish the same ends. Here we have the electric substation that allows us to bring electricity in from other areas. Okay, second example, carbon reduction through end-use energy switching. This allows us to go from more carbon-intensive forms of energy to less carbon forms by doing the same functions. This is US data on the use of carbon dioxide emissions from the different sectors. But if you think of transportation, we have electric vehicles, electric vehicles and hydrogen fuel cell vehicles. Each one of them release less carbon dioxide per mile driven than the equivalent gasoline fueled vehicles. You have the electric trains. We even have experimentally electric airplanes. These pods down here, unfortunately, are not places where passengers or luggage sit. Those are places where batteries sit right now. So we don't have any cargo space or any passenger space. But this is experimental. This is the beginning. So even in air transportation, we're figuring out ways that we can fuel switch to hydrogen or electricity. In the commercial, instead of cooking with natural gas, this is an inductive cooker. Here we have the heat pumps for heating and for cooling buildings. So instead of using fossil fuels, instead of using boilers to heat buildings, you can move it towards electricity. And even in industry, even in steel making, we have now electric arc furnaces. There's a lot of industrial processes such as this where we've automated, and the automation creates it all electric, maybe substituting more for labor. But essentially, around in China and the United States, we are finding ways of substituting for a low carbon form of energy to perform the same end uses. And most of these pictures I happen to choose from China rather than US. If I was giving this to a US audience, I could choose US pictures that did the same thing. Clean energy production. Well, most of the clean energy production techniques generate electricity. So that's one of the reasons we want a strategy of moving towards electricity, because if we think of the whole system, that's the way that's the energy generation that is easiest to decarbonize or most capable. So we have electricity generation through wind power. This is called the Ibanapa. Solar, it's a good scale solar system in a desert in California. These are all mirrors. These are all mirrors that reflect the sun and up to this focal point. And this focal point heats up water, boils the water, heats up the water, and down here is a quite conventional electric generating plant that uses steam to high temperature steam to generate electricity. But the steam is, the water is not boiled and turned into steam through fossil fuels. It's turned into it by all of these mirrors reflecting the sun onto the focal point. Other electricity generation, we have like the Three Gorges Dam, we have the geysers geothermal plant, we have nuclear power plants. These are all ways that we're finding to decarbonize the generation of electricity, and these all are through clean energy production for electricity. But notice that most everything I've showed is electricity. We have fewer options for creating liquids. We have biomass that we can grow deliberately to turn into ethanol or biobutane or biodiesel. We can use renewables, wind and solar to create hydrogen through electrolysis of water. And so there are ways to generate electricity, energy other than electricity, but these tend to be very expensive. So the ways that we're going forward tend to be in electricity, and that's why we have the idea of the end use switching towards electricity, which looks like it will be the cheapest way we can have decarbonized energy. Then carbon capture and storage. We may want to be using fossil fuels. We can enhance oil recovery by ejecting carbon dioxide into the ground and store it permanently, or you can just inject carbon dioxide into deep saltwater formations, saline formations, and we believe it can be kept permanently there. But there's a lot of ongoing research, and again, this is a very costly process. It's not nearly economic yet, but that's sort of the fourth pathway. Okay, from those fourth pathways, I'd like to present a quantitative framework that I like to use, other people can use for a quantitative analysis of the pathways. And it uses something called the Kaya identity. And we can decompose carbon dioxide emissions from energy consumption into three factors. And this is just an identity in the sense, identity means that for every set of numbers that are internally consistent, this equation all holds, because carbon dioxide, we just say we can think of as the gross national product, that is the overall economic activity, multiplied by the energy use per dollar or per RMB of economic activity, multiplied by the carbon dioxide per use of energy. So it's just an identity, but it's a useful identity for thinking about the issues. Think about GDP as a measure of economic growth and development. In the international negotiations, there is not one country in the world that says, we want to control carbon dioxide by crushing our economy. by stopping our economy from growing. Neither China nor the US have said that. They've all said, we want to use less energy, but continue a healthy economy. So generally, policy does not try to reduce GDP. The second is energy intensity of the economy, energy per unit of GDP. That's how efficiently we use energy. And the third, carbon intensity per unit of energy, how clean is the energy? Then mathematically, since carbon dioxide emissions is a product of those, if we differentiate those, the rate of growth of carbon dioxide emissions is the sum of the rate of growth of these three things. So it becomes convenient to analyze the historical data and to think about what may be happening in the future. So let me relate those. Energy efficiency, which reduces the amount of energy use, that is linked to these two elements of the Kaya identity. GDP times energy use per unit of GDP, where energy efficiency is really the energy use per unit of gross domestic product. And use substitution, that will then lead to less carbon dioxide per unit of energy use. Clean energy production leads to less carbon dioxide per unit of energy use. And carbon capture and storage leads to less carbon dioxide per energy use. So you can link these concepts of energy efficiency, end use substitution, clean energy production, carbon capture and storage to the three factors in the Kaya identity. Caveat now, some of these reductions of carbon intensity are not economically efficient. And as a policy-making process, your nation and my nation has intense debates about what of those things are most economically efficient, which will be good for the nation, which will lead to the appropriate security that you want, which leads to the distributional consequences, and those issues are crucial. So I want to use these trends to show how I use them to evaluate, at least historically, the importance of these four pathways. I'm going to start with the US, the carbon reduction trends, using the Kaya identity. And I plotted out the four things in terms of annual average rates of growth. Remember, carbon dioxide annual rate of growth will be the sum of those other three rates of growth. So the blue is the energy intensity of the economy. This says before the oil crisis in 1973, for those 13 years, the average rate of change was about minus 0.3%, 0.3% a year. The carbon intensity of energy use was declining about 0.3% per year. You add those together and it's almost 0.6% per year. That would be the carbon intensity of the economy. But the US economy was growing on average 4.3%. The carbon intensity was declining about 0.6%, and therefore the carbon dioxide emissions were growing about 3.7%. So that's how you can read this graph, and you can see that was happened before the crisis. When there was the oil embargo in 1973 and oil prices quadrupled, in the United States, that's when we started paying attention to energy policy. It was a great shock to us. And what happened after that point is there was a lot of policy making, but there was also a lot of private sector activities. And if we look at each of these years, the rates of changes became very different than before the crisis. Once the US put its national attention to deal with the energy problems, these rates of change became very important. And I've grouped this by presidential administration, Nixon, Ford, Carter, Reagan, Bush, Clinton, and Bush. And I stopped there for a reason, because I got to show you something different for Obama and Trump. But you notice that energy intensity of the economy was growing here, decreasing 1.5%, 2.5%, 2.75%, 2%. Now, 2% a year, when you average over 50 years, makes a very large difference in the energy intensity. As one of the things that I think is very special about how China government tends to think is, it's a long-term, everything is long-term. You don't think just year to year, you think of long-term. Well, you think about here in the US, energy efficiency at about 2% a year average for 50 years has made a fundamental change. The red is the carbon intensity of energy use. The system wasn't getting any cleaner at all, very slowly. And then the economy was growing usually between 2 and 4% a year during this time. And so with the carbon intensity of the economy going down, declining in the order of 1.5 to 2.5%, then carbon dioxide emissions continue to increase over every presidential administration. Then during the Obama administration, something happened. And what happened is that we started cleaning up the energy system. We started a process of both renewables and moving away from coal, bringing in natural gas to squeeze out coal, and the system started getting cleaner. And so that the combination of energy efficiency and energy intensity and carbon intensity of energy use improving, we have about a 3% decline per year. But during the Obama administration, on the average, the economy grew only 1.5%. So carbon dioxide emissions declined about 1.5% a year. Now you're all guessing about what happened in the Trump administration. Surprise! In the Trump administration, the carbon intensity of energy use kept declining because the processes that had started with energy policies that happened well before Donald Trump stayed in place. The new technologies that allowed natural gas to be created and to substitute for coal stayed in place. And that although Donald Trump wanted to protect the coal industry, the economic forces were more powerful than him as president. So the system energy system continued to get better. Private sector activities kept leading to more energy efficiency, so that the carbon intensity of the economy declined on the average 4% a year during all of the Trump administration. The economy grew very slowly on the average under the Trump administration because at the end of COVID, and so the carbon dioxide emissions in the United States declined 3% a year average over the time Donald Trump was in office. So this is how you may use this as an analytical framework to interpret what happened in the history of the United States. Okay, well, we might want to use that for China. Now, I'm not organizing it by presidential administrations, and I don't have data going quite as far. I get back to 1990 for China. but we have this for 5-year intervals in China. And what we see that these are some pretty big numbers. You have high growth rates, but the energy intensity energy intensity of the economy, for most parts, declined either before 2000, then 2000 you started really industrializing. Energy intensity of the economy was declining less rapidly, but it's still a 3% a year. And but you were not doing much, like United States, you're not doing much to clean up your energy system, like United States in the earlier years. Your economy was growing somewhere between 7% and 12% a year in real values. And so your carbon dioxide emissions, the black, were naturally increasing along with your economy. Now, just to put this on, just to compare it with the US, I have the US data now by 5 years in the same scale. So it's the same 13% minus 8%. It looks like that. So China, and some of the same patterns are the same, but China is just much bigger scale in the rates of change than in the United States, because the Chinese economy, so much is changing so rapidly in what you're doing. So you can use this same analytical framework to think about what's going on and apply it to the discussions about the future. Then finally, I said in the US, we have these last years during Obama and Trump administration, cleaning up the energy system. Well, there's a way of analyzing what was underlying the cleaning up of the energy system. You can look at the percentages of the different fuels and see how clean each one was relative to the average, and look at the factors underlying decarbonization from 2005 through 2020. Notice that almost half of the decline is because we reduce the use of coal. Coal is the most carbon intense of all of the forms of energy we use. We see natural gas growth. Natural gas is cleaner than the average of the US system, but only a little bit cleaner. So that the growth of natural gas contributes only a little bit to this. Coal is a lot dirtier than the average, so that the decline of coal makes a large difference, even though the quantity of natural gas increase was about equal to the quantity of coal decrease. Natural gas pushed them out. So if you look at blue plus the black, that is the result of deliberate action on mostly the oil companies and gas companies to find natural gas to produce that and compete with coal. And in the private sector, coal got squeezed out, and that's been half of the growth. The other important things, nuclear didn't make much difference. It didn't have much of an impact because it didn't have much growth during that time. We have growth in the biomass, wind. Solar, by the way, is it's the smallest component of it. It probably is the part that gets the most attention. But if you quantify it, solar growth has been actually quite small in decarbonizing. It's mostly, half of it is natural gas pushing out coal. Then the decline in petroleum helped. Then the biomass growth and the wind growth are the bigger factor of the renewable. So you can go through that. Okay, so that's analytical framework for quantifying it. Then there's policies, okay? These pathways don't happen just by themselves. They happen by a combination of companies, people, NGOs, organizations helping promote this going on, and government policies. Excuse me, take a glass of water. And so if we think of these various policies and we ask what are these various pathways, what are the various strategies that can be used? And I'll just point at a couple of them very briefly, but I've color-coded them. The green means that this policy, these class of policies can encourage the particular pathway. So a carbon tax or cap and trade system can be effective in encouraging energy efficiency, end-use substitution, low carbon energy production, carbon capture and storage. Whereas a gasoline tax will lead to energy efficiency and maybe end-use substitution, because if it's more expensive to drive a conventional internal combustion engine, you're more likely to switch to electric vehicles. So gasoline tax can be helpful in both of those, but of course does nothing over here. There are so many more policy options than I've been able to list. So these are just illustrative, but in the US, we use a lot of financial subsidies. You do in China as well. Wind, solar, biomass subsidies. Notice, by the way, the subsidies, by making electricity cheaper, discourage energy efficiency. Because if energy is cheaper, there's less need for energy efficiency. So the financial subsidies discourage energy efficiency, where a carbon tax or cap and trade system will encourage energy efficiency. Where these subsidies at the same time will encourage low carbon energy production, carbon capture and storage. Very important policy is research and development, where we have direct grants and tax credits. Direct grants is the government, includes the government research institutions that are engaging in that. And those R&D and continuing R&D for China and for the United States are very fundamental to making these technologies better. And as an editorial, exchanging of technological knowledge is very important for having the advances in either country be helpful in the other country. They're helpful for the world. In the US, we use a lot of regulations. You do too in China. Automobile fuel efficiency standards, appliance efficiency standards. If you look at in the United States, among the energy intense end-use appliances, those appliances that use a lot of energy, about between 80 and 90% are subject to energy efficiency regulations in the United States, which are based upon doing a benefit cost test in order to force more energy efficiency. In the US, direct action on federal assets. In China, there's federal assets, which direct assets. One of the things I point out now is that there's an environmental community that's trying to restrict drilling contracts, restrict oil and gas pipeline permits. I indicate that those probably has a very, very small impact on the amount of carbon, because if you don't get natural gas moving through, say, the XL pipeline, it will move at a higher cost by railroad lines. And so many of the restrictions that environmental communities are pushing after probably had very little impact when it's just restricting drilling permits. But on federal lands, you can have wind and solar contracts. How the federal government manages buildings makes a difference for those buildings, but it creates a model for other people to see and creates opportunities. And then there's the behavioral interventions, one that we've studied a lot here at Stanford, information strategies, nudges. I'm going to talk a little more about those corporate disclosure rules that can make a difference for each one of these. So let me just spend the last few minutes I have to just talk a little bit about some of these pricing strategies aimed to motivate people and corporations to move along these various pathways. Pricing strategy, carbon tax or cap and trade. You in China are studying a type of cap and trade system for the electric utilities first, maybe later for the whole economy, right now just for the electric utilities, that are not trading carbon permits, but carbon attributes and carbon intensity permits, but has some of the same characteristics of cap and trade. Many economists, including myself, would like to see either a broad cap and trade in the United States or a carbon tax. Those can be effective for all the pathways. They increase the price of all energy intensive products, and therefore people use them less. And it changes the production processes. Companies decide they want to move away from energy intensive production. But because you have the future opportunity for getting more profitable products with R&D and encourage research and development into low energy, low carbon products. And also it encourages company managers to adopt processes that waste less energy, particularly if energy is more expensive. Then in a corporation, there's an incentive to get your managers to use less energy. Specific tax like a gasoline tax has some of the same effects, motivate purchases of more fuel efficient vehicles. It motivates reduction of driving and encourages people to move to other cars. So that's pricing strategies, I believe, for your country and mine should be an important part of the policy mix. Information strategies, we've used a lot in the United States, but you have as well in China. Labeling of appliances, so lifetime energy costs. When you buy a refrigerator in China, you can find out how much energy is used, same as in the United States. That causes people to pay attention to energy use. If you didn't tell them how much energy a refrigerator was going to use, they probably wouldn't know, and therefore there would be less incentive to buy the energy efficient refrigerators. In the US, we have commercial building performance rating and rating disclosures. So when you're leasing out a building or selling a building in the commercial space, you've got to tell them how energy efficient that building is. And that helps changes in negotiation of purchase terms and therefore encourages owners of the building to do energy efficiency. Smart metering and feedback. We have smart electric metering and we can give people feedback about their energy use. So it's one of those adages, anything that you can't measure, you'll never manage. So smart meters help them measure it, as does building information management systems. It allows managers better information. We use nudges a lot. Nudges are ways of allowing people to make their own choice, but pushing them in one direction, nudging them. In the US, in most utilities, when you get your bill, you'll see a comparison of how much electricity you use in comparison to that of your neighbors. That is, if you use a lot more electricity than your neighbors, which is fairly equivalent buildings. I hope my wife answers that phone quickly. Okay, let me turn the volume. Okay, I can't hear it now. Okay. If you use more electricity on your bill, will be a big yellow frown on your bill. And if you use less than your neighbors, a big smile on your bill. It sounds silly, but that, excuse me. Wes, I can't talk with you now. I'll call you later. I'm giving a seminar. Bye-bye. That was my son calling. I'm on one phone versus the other. That leads to about 2% on the average reduction in energy use. Just those little smiles or those frowns in comparison. Within corporations, energy use reporting is part of the performance evaluations, motivates workers and managers to pay more attention. If you have to report out energy use to your boss as he or she is evaluating you for a raise or not, and that's part of the criteria, well, then you're motivated to use less energy. We have public interest radio and television alerts. Some labeling like the Energy Star is like an implicit endorsement of energy use. People will say, hey, if it's the Energy Star, it's a suggestion, it's good. So this is often when things don't have a lot of financial consequences for the individual, then nudges are very useful for changing people's behavior. Or if you make it so it wouldn't have had many financial consequences. For example, the manager managing energy use in his or her area of operation, and you make it so that it does have financial consequences, that is, it's part of its performance or her performance review, then nudges are very important. So the nudges and information, these are the type of labeling that we see in the United States, which tells you if you buy a car, not just how much it's going to cost, but the annual cost of fuel at the average price of gasoline, because behavioral studies tell you if you have the information in front of you when you make a decision to buy the car, then that information can be relevant. Same for buying refrigerators. So we go back, I want to end it up with these slides. I find it useful for me as I think about what can happen in the US, and I hope you can think about what maybe useful in China, to think of this sort of matrix. What are the policy options that are being considered? Which of these pathways they make a difference for? Try to start quantifying them using something like the Kaya identity, and then do the economic evaluation of them to see the impact of them on the economic performance, as well as to do a security evaluation, how much how secure the energy system becomes with the various changes, and how less secure that may be. I don't have time in this seminar to talk about all of those characteristics, but if you think about the combination of the energy policy triangle as these three characteristics, then there's 4 pathways that we might want to think about of how we get cleaner energy. We can think about a framework for evaluating them quantitatively, historically, and making judgments for the future using a Kaya identity, and then look at the relationship between different policy options, interventions, and these pathways. You can start becoming, I think, more systematic as an energy policy analyst, and helping make good decisions to move China and the US together forward to help on dealing with this really fundamental environmental issue of our day, energy, global climate change. And on that, I will stop and thank you, Shishay, for being such a good audience.